Kia ora. I'm a rational person. I expect many of you, if not all of you, consider yourself to be rational too. We don't walk around wearing tinfoil hats. Widespread online surveillance by governments around the world is a fact, not a conspiracy. Being online, it's largely invisible, but the effects of online surveillance are nevertheless very real and very tangible. If I had given this talk a year ago, I would have probably have joined you in dismissing it as the product of an overactive imagination of conspiracy theorists. So what's changed in the last year? Two things. First, the documents leaked by Edward Snowden about the United States spy agency, the NSA, the National Security Agency, and my own personal experience. First, let's consider how a rational person feels and behaves when placed under targeted online surveillance. When every email and every text message sent and received over the last 5 to 10 years is retrieved and analyzed. When every financial transaction and everything you've searched for online is viewed with suspicion. When every place you've been and every person in your address book become a potential target simply because they've been in contact with you. How do you feel knowing that simply because you are here today listening to me, that fact alone is sufficient for you to potentially be under online surveillance? Would you behave differently if you knew this? The explanation for all of this is something called national interest. It's shorthand for governments to say any reason whatsoever, as long as you're not a citizen of their country. There are some rules which limit government spying on their citizens. Almost none to spy on everyone else. None of this should be of concern to you, say governments. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. For over a century, governments have over and over again repeated in one form or another, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear from surveillance. The argument goes something like this. If you have nothing to hide, then surveillance won't turn up anything bad. On the other hand, if you have done something wrong, then the government should know, and you hadn't got a right to hide it in the first place. Now, this makes intuitive sense to many people. And that's why it's been so effective. And that's why it continues to be used even today to justify government surveillance. Now, many people have debunked this. But what I want to do is to share my own experience with you so that you can make up your mind whether you think this nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument stacks up to close scrutiny. It's a story of how a rational person would feel and behave if they were in my place. It's a story of having lived the nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument for over a year now. The story starts with my joining an internet startup as its chief executive. The company's founders were under surveillance, illegally as it turned out, by the New Zealand spy agency, the GCSB, the Government Communications Security Bureau, and its partner, the NSA. The startup wasn't doing anything bad or illegal, but clearly it was in the national interest of the United States to keep a close eye on the company's founders and everyone else associated with the company. The company was one of the fastest growing internet startups in the world, providing people, ironically enough, better privacy and security online. Not terrorists, drug dealers, or any of the other types of justification that governments roll out for spying on people. I believe I was placed under targeted online surveillance by the NSA in February 2013, just over a year ago. My initial reaction was to laugh and joke about it. Right? People would come up to me and talk about it, and I'd be, yeah, you know what, I'm also a target for drone strikes now. Watch out, or you'll be collateral damage. Right? I would send some emails and say, hello, do you do NSA? I'd switch off my mobile phone, and then as helicopters went overhead, I'd wave out to them. It turns out that if you're counting, there's one hell of a lot of helicopters flying around in New Zealand. But it turned out, and I realized later on, that the laughter was a facade, as a coping mechanism. It was beginning to get to me. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they were being nurtured by this constant joking about surveillance. I was determined not to be paranoid, right? But even I couldn't help noticing that my mobile phone battery would drain very quickly, that my Skype conversations were increasingly becoming unstable. And I had to constantly remind myself that the NSA was fully capable of spying on me without my knowing it. Gradually, I began to get angry. Who gave the United States government the right to spy on me? How dare they? Why should faceless analysts halfway around the world and algorithms tear my life apart? All the laughter was gone now. It was replaced by a deep sense of anger at this arrogant bully who had these enormous resources picking on me. I did try my best to use technical means to limit the amount of information that I was revealing about myself. For example, I used an encrypted internet tunnel called the virtual private network. There were times when I felt compelled to reach out to my watchers and explain myself to them. So when my daughter used my computer to search for stories about 9/11, I felt this real need to tell the watchers, don't worry, it's only a school assignment. After some time, there was a brief period when I fell into a stifling depression. I was really unhappy that I had placed my family and everyone who had contacted me for anything at all as a potential target themselves. I had this utter sense of hopelessness, of being completely powerless, emasculated. There were times when I started blaming myself. The internet, which was my friend, had become a fatal weakness. Finally, I got to a point where I realized that there was nothing I could do to stop the NSA from getting the information that it wanted. So I could secure all my devices, maybe, but the NSA could always get that information as it traveled on the internet. Or they could easily go to the many US-based service providers that I used for email, for communications, for financial transactions. I accepted that there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop the NSA. It was time for me to move on, get on with my life, and hope for the best. Hope that I wouldn't suddenly appear on some no-fly list. Hope that I wouldn't be stopped at borders for questioning. Hope that all the information that they had collected about me, they weren't motivated enough to try and pin something on me. So that's acceptance. And I think I'd like you to think about two things from my own personal experience. First, that if a spy agency like the NSA decides to put someone under surveillance, they have such enormous resources, financial, technical, and people, that really it's only a matter of time before they get to know everything that they need to know about that person. Being technically skilled can, at best, delay things or make it harder, but really it's only a question of time. Second, This nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument, I think it only works at a superficial level. It takes a very narrow view of privacy, as if privacy is only about something to hide. I think what it does is it ignores the stripping away of private space that we need to be human. A space that we need to think, to work, to live, to be ourselves. Imagine if you saw a peeping Tom peering through the windows at you in your home. It's not that you're necessarily doing anything bad or wrong or you've got something to hide. The very act of invading your private space causes distress. Now, the 5 stages that I went through in dealing with my emotional distress of targeted surveillance, I don't think it's any coincidence that they are the same 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross described as the grieving process. These are the steps that we go through as people in trying to cope with death or other severe forms of emotional trauma. In my case, it was trying to deal with the emotional distress of being placed under targeted surveillance. So, when you hear governments telling you nothing to hide, nothing to fear, I hope you'll pause and question it. Know that you're being played by a false dichotomy. But there's something even more dangerous and more damaging going on right now than targeted surveillance. Mass surveillance, where everyone is under online surveillance, not just the targeted specific few. Thanks to Edward Snowden, we now know the true extent to which this is going on right now. At least with targeted surveillance, it's about putting the bad guys under surveillance. With mass surveillance, it's everyone, all the time. Everything on the internet is swept in and analyzed to try and find the bad guys in the first place. This is a fundamental shift. And yet, mass surveillance doesn't work. There are exactly 0 cases where mass surveillance on its own has actually revealed a national security threat. Under the cover of nothing to hide, nothing to fear, governments are intruding into every corner of our lives. I think it's really important that we all truly understand what's going on, because it's inevitable that rational people will reject mass surveillance. Collectively, we have to draw the boundaries for mass surveillance in this new place that we find ourselves. Our sense of place is no longer defined by our physical interactions alone. The internet connects us to the world, but by the same token, it makes each one of us an easy target for anyone and everyone all over the world. So we need to pause and think about these things because we have set boundaries before. For example, we don't accept putting a camera in every room of every building in the world. That's mass surveillance, and we reject it. Right now, it's governments on their own, in secrecy, and according to their own definition of national interest, drawing these boundaries. Back in the late 18th century, Englishman Jeremy Bentham came up with a new design for institutional buildings, such as prisons, called the Panopticon, in which a single person could observe all the inmates of the institution without them knowing whether or not they were under surveillance. So inmates had no way of knowing if and when they were being observed. Therefore, they behaved as if they were being observed all the time, including self-controlling their own behavior. Now, Bentham called his Panopticon a new idea in architecture, leading to a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind. No buildings were ever constructed to Bentham's Panopticon designs. The closest was this prison built in Cuba in the 1920s. Mass surveillance by governments has turned the internet into a modern version of Bentham's Panopticon on a global scale. In Bentham's words, a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind. The very things that make the internet so beneficial, so successful, for example, its global reach, are the very things that make it ideal as a panopticon. There is one thing that you can do to stop mass surveillance, and that's to raise its cost by making it more difficult. The simplest thing to do is to use encryption online. That means preferring online services that use encryption over those that don't. Encrypting email, for example, is the equivalent of putting a letter inside an envelope rather than writing your message on the back of a postcard and hoping that no one would casually read it in its transit. I hope my experience would have shown you that targeted surveillance can be bad, but at least it's justified in the small number of cases where there is a genuine national security threat. Mass surveillance, on the other hand, must be totally rejected. It does not work. Rational people will think and question and reject the nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument. We have to draw the boundaries for surveillance in this new place, not governments on their own in secrecy. If there is one thing the last year has shown, it's this, that we simply do not have the option of closing our eyes and pleading ignorance anymore. Thank you.